In 1992, a 23-year-old man was sentenced to life for the senseless murder of an innocent person. 2 years later, his name would become infamous following a prison encounter with notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, an encounter that only one of them would survive. Sometimes it takes a monster to kill a monster. This is the story of the man who killed the Milwaukee cannibal. This is the case of Christopher Scarver. Hi guys, welcome back and thank you for joining me. If you're new to this channel, I release my deep dive crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday. If you like crime and consistency, please subscribe to this channel, give me a like, get involved in the comments, get involved in a live premiere. They are full of really lovely human beings who are part of Kenny's crime cult. Also, for those of you who want to see me on tour in the UK, I have so many dates coming out next year. I actually think that I'm going to have some kind of aneurysm. Genuinely terrified. Massive places and theatres that I'll be presenting my show next year. So please catch up with me. I always come and say hi at the end and love meeting you and getting a big hug. It's great. Also, to those of you who support me on Patreon and YouTube membership, thank you so much, because I put a lot of time into this. It makes the content possible, and without you, well, I wouldn't be here. I'd be doing something else because I wouldn't be able to make it. So I just want to say thank you. Everybody is appreciated, but anybody who comes here per se, your eyes, your views, they have great meaning. Thank you so much. So today's case is one that I wanted to cover because obviously Dahmer is in the news right now. Early on YouTube, I did the Dahmer case. And I suppose back then I should have thought about who was this man who murdered him? What was his backstory? He's kind of hailed as a bit of a hero, isn't he? Would that make sense if I looked into his background? Or was it maybe just a myth? Because it's more comfortable to imagine that there is a just type of killing where an individual like Jeffrey Dahmer is concerned. And with him being in the news because of the Netflix series, I thought, why not now? So I spent some time, my brother spent some time, and together we kind of deep dived into who this man was. So Christopher Scarver was born on the 6th of July, 1969 in Milwaukee. That's in Wisconsin, by the way. He was the second of 5 children, and during his life, what I would say about him, certainly from the anecdotes around people who knew him and from his own expressions within his incarceration, and just in general throughout his prison life, how he's demonstrated his position on these areas, he struggled with extreme racial discrimination. And we cannot underestimate individuals who have spent their lives facing and feeling that they are not respected as a human being because of the colour of their skin, who may have been placed in positions where success was out of reach because of people's judgments, and who formed a deep level of rage and resentment towards the parties that they feel have prevented them from succeeding. It's incomprehensible. And I'm a woman, and without a doubt, as a woman, you understand that there'll be certain types of isms that affect you, but I wouldn't for 1 minute try to even imagine what it would be like for somebody to look at me and think, you're less than me because of the colour of your skin, you're less than me because of who you are. And for this individual, that's definitely what he faced and felt during his life. And that deep resentment, particularly of white people, he actually went on later down the line to tell a prison psychiatrist, nothing white people do is just. Now that's an extreme perspective, and I think we can all agree here that the vast majority of human beings, we all get on well. I think we're in an incredible race because as a human race, realistically, there's still primordial context within us. There's still a reality of tribalism, and therefore to coexist in so many different ways actually says something quite wonderful about us. But if you happen to have experienced these levels of prejudice, it's understandable that you're going to internalize that to a degree. And for some, that can become self-loathing, which is terrible. For others, it can be, how do I work this through and educate people so it becomes progressive? And that can be used in a really positive way. And for others, it can be really rage-provoking. And certainly he fits that latter category. One of the things that Scarver didn't succeed in was his education. So he never graduated from high school. He actually dropped out in his senior year. And the reason that he dropped out in his senior year was because he did have discipline problems, and also there were performance issues academically. But I presume it would be the discipline issues that were causing the major problem within his education. And because of that, when he leaves, he goes on to look at traineeships, and he becomes a trainee carpenter working on the Wisconsin Conservation Corps job program. So what that program did was it basically provided an opportunity for people who were not in work to carry out a training that could then ensure that they could move into a career. And in this case, we're talking about the training in carpentry. However, he later goes on and drops out of that course. And it's important to note that we've had now a dropout of education and a dropout in a course that would have led into employment, because this man thinks that it's all about the colour of his skin. And without a doubt, racism exists. But we've also got to have personal responsibility and accountability, and potentially the way he was perceiving the world could also have a level of paranoia associated with it. And his inability to succeed in these environments, it could be systemic racism, but it could also be his belief systems around the reality of his work environment that aren't actually real. It could be that it's his actions and behaviours that are also causing these issues with rejection and abandonment. I do not know which of those it was, or whether it was both, or whether it was one or the other. I'm just saying psychologically that's a possibility, because we have to think about this man's mental state is important throughout this actual case. When he gets dropped from that course, I would say this is when it coincides essentially with the downward spiral of his life. So he starts to drink excessively, he starts using drugs, and it gets so bad that he's even kicked out of the family home by his mother. And she does that because she feels that his behaviour, and certainly the excesses that I've just talked about, and probably as well the issues with him not staying in education and work, she believes that starts to have a negative influence potentially on his siblings, and does not want that influence to infect the other's behaviour. Now, his girlfriend is actually pregnant at the time that he's kicked out of home, and she does go on to give birth to a little baby boy who was called Christopher. So around this time, he's had a lot of stress. He's drinking, taking drugs. He's lost his, shall we say, way forward as far as learning a trade. And suddenly, on top of all of this, he starts to hear voices. It's when he's drunk, and these voices start to refer to him as the chosen one. Now, later down the line, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And what we would say is that when somebody is hearing these kind of delusions, and they can be incredibly real, it's very hard if you haven't worked in this field, or you are not somebody who's ever had these kind of experiences. When we talk about auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations as well, it's not as if it's a blurry, imagined perception. It's like having somebody stood in the room with you, speaking to you. Sometimes it can be inside your head. Sometimes it can be as if they're behind you. But it feels as real as I am feeling to you now saying this. And that's very difficult when you live in a reality where everything has sounded real in the way it has, and then all of a sudden you're hearing something that seems equally as real as every other voice you've ever heard. That's challenging to navigate. And this particular type of delusion is very common. I've worked with a lot of people who've had what would be considered a messianic delusion, which basically means that they believe that they are chosen by God. So this is not unusual. And I think that it's very challenging for us to be able to understand how that would feel unless we've been in a position like that. My own father, when he was dealing with his psychosis, he believed that he was responsible for causing World War One, Two, and Three. He either protected the one we might be getting into, but realistically was just believing all these things that he'd done were true. And in that sense, he was seeing himself as somebody who was a leader. It's very similar in this ilk that I'm talking about. So these messianic kind of delusions are very difficult, and it's often why people end up telling the world that they're Jesus, for example. They believe that there's a saviour, and this man definitely did. He believed at that point that he was the saviour. So on the 1st of June 1990, Scarver's not got any money. He's short of money. And what he decides to do is he decides that he's going to go and rob Wisconsin Conservation Corps. And the reason that he had this mentality for doing this is that he believed that they owed him. He felt that they had slurred him. He'd lost his position. He felt that there'd been false promises. And as opposed to being able to acknowledge his own accountability in his shortcomings in that scenario and situation, he instead decides that he's going to project blame. So one of the problems he has is that his supervisor, Edward Patz, who he worked under, at the time of him being there working under this man, he'd been promised things. So Edward Patz had actually said to him, I'll give you a full-time job once you've completed the program. And that would have been massive to this guy. Here we are, an individual who struggled, not succeeded in school, has had issues in his life in lots of different areas and ways and whys. And suddenly we're in a scenario where this guy says, I see talent in you. And I'm not just going to see talent, I'm going to acknowledge that. And I'm going to do something really progressive for you. I'm going to give you a full-time job. And I imagine Scarver was thrilled. But unfortunately for Scarver, Edward Patz actually loses his job. And that means that he was never hired full-time. So this lays heavy on his mind. And the way that he manifests this is to want to get even. He sees that they have stolen something from him, in his mind, his future, possibilities, and no doubt it's regurgitated and recreated and re-emphasized those feelings of not being seen as equal and that rage that he carries with him. So armed with a .25 caliber, which is a semi-automatic pistol, he goes and he confronts the site manager there. This is a guy called John Fayan. He's just in the office at the time. And during this situation, he also forces a crew chief who works there, which is a 27-year-old man. He's called Steve Lohman. And he gets Steve Lohman to lie on the floor. Now, the potential connection between Steve Lohman and Scarver is that he had actually replaced Patz when he'd been dismissed. So he gets him, lies him on the floor. You can't even imagine what would be going on in that man's head. I mean, he's a completely innocent individual. He's had nothing to do with any of this. And suddenly he's finding himself in an armed robbery, essentially. And at this point, Scarver says to Fayan, I want cash, give me cash. Now, Fayan, and I don't really understand what was going on in Fayan's mind when he handed over $15. I am going to just take a step back and imagine myself in that position. I am going to imagine that Fayan was literally hearing Scarver saying, give me some money. And he wasn't really computing that Scarver wanted a huge amount of money. He's imagining that he wants whatever he's got. And it's likely that Fayan literally hands over $15 because that's what he's got physically on him. When Scarver sees the amount of money that Fayan's handed over to him, it's like it sparks a sense of insult It's as if Scarver feels that this is yet another individual, another man, another white guy who's just going out of their way to disrespect him. Even when he literally has a semi-automatic handgun and a hostage on the floor, even at this point, he's only worth $15. Can you imagine if you have some delusions and you also have some rage and you have some real feelings of negativity towards a particular race in this scenario, and you look at that and you think to yourself, they aren't even scared of me in this moment, or they feel that I'm only worth this. And the response to that $15 being handed over to Scarver is he literally just shoots Steve in the head. And then he says, now, do you think I'm kidding? I need more money. So you can imagine now, Fayen has probably lost his mind in that moment, because it's gone from what he believed was a scenario where he was going to get robbed to basically being the reasoning, as far as Scarver is concerned, for literally shooting an innocent man in the head who's got absolutely no idea what the hell is being played out here. And now he knows that his life is under threat. That's a really terrifying moment to experience. You feel a culpability for the death that's just occurred and a personal fear for what may happen to you, because this man now has made it clear that he's willing to kill. So he is in a right state, but manages to write Scarver a check for $3,000. The response to this is that Scarver shoots Steve in the head again. So he's letting him know that's not enough either, which is something that, for me, levels an excuse and lack of accountability again within Scarver. Look, if you want a certain amount of money and it's going to stop you from literally shooting a man in the head again, why don't you specifically dictate that is? Ask them for $50,000, put it in a check for $50,000. We all know that's not going to work out, is it? Because a $50,000 check would just be not cashed when it got to the actual bank because of the fact there'd be police waiting for you. But that's not what this seems to be about, is it? It feels like this is a license in that moment to leverage all the feelings that this individual has and project them at Fayen. And when he hands him that check, he says, that's still not enough. And he shoots Steve in the head again. And then during the process of Fayen actually writing and signing over a payroll check, Scarver just shoots Steve a third time in the head. Then he grabs the check. He grabs Fayen's credit card as well and runs from the office. But he doesn't just run as in I'm leaving. He runs while shooting at Fayen. He actually missed him, but the point was he likely wasn't intending to leave any witnesses whatsoever. Also, at this point, we can all be aware that Scarver is going to know that he's left a witness alive, and he's going to know that he's going to be brought in by the authorities. Now, during the course of what I would consider to categorise that murder that we've just talked about as an execution-style killing, Scarver also allegedly made references to white people's mistreatment of black people. And I think that from what we can see from the early childhood experiences regarding his feelings of being racially profiled, racially abused, treated differently, and what we've seen play out in apparently this crime where he's being very negative towards white people, that hostility is something that really lives within him all the time. So then they launch a manhunt, of course they do, and it's not long, it's several hours later to be fair, because Scarver's not got anywhere to run essentially, and the check's not going to get him anywhere. The authorities know exactly who he is, and that means that essentially he's been caught bang to rights. He's going to accept the consequences to some degree because he's not going to get away with it. So police end up finding him and he's just sat on the steps of his girlfriend's apartment building. There's a little bit of me when I say that feels the inevitability within his mind was clear, and there's a little bit of that emotion that you can't help but experience when you think about this man who's carried out this utterly heinous crime, literally executing a man. And he's done it for little reason because he was never going to get away with it. And then there's that reality hits and he goes to his girlfriend's apartment and is sitting there because he knows ultimately he's really screwed up and he's not going to get away with this by any way, shape or form. And there's just that moment where you think, they're coming to the senses potentially, the recognition and reality of the action just starting to set in. They find him when he's there, by the way, sat with the gun, the check and the credit card. So he's not even tried to dispose of any of those. And he says to the officer when they come up to him that he knew what he'd done, he knew it was wrong. And he says that he didn't really know why he'd done it, it just snapped. Now bear in mind, as much as he might have had quite a dysfunctional past regarding education, jobs, so on and so forth, even with his living conditions, with the fact that he's thrown out of home, he's never ever had a violent past. There's literally no records of any violent offences whatsoever. And remember, he's just about to become a dad for the first time. So to some degree, this was a place and a position for Scarver where he may ultimately have been able to have dreams be realised, a partner, a child, just a change in circumstance. But of course, the actions that he's just carried out are going to mean that that becomes impossible. He also said he'd planned to turn himself in, but one of the things that had happened is that those voices that he was having in his head, they'd actually told him to do what he'd done. They'd told him to carry out the murder. And he referred to these voices as the family. Again, if you're not used to working with people who've had auditory hallucinations, deal with schizophrenia, etc., then you may find that difficult. I suppose you might have heard of people who deal with dissociative disorder, which is where people believe that there are alters, so different people living within themselves. You might have heard of those referred to as families, because some do refer to it that way. But he's literally referring to the family being an embodiment of 4 different individuals within his head, very separate from one another. So there's a voice of a woman, a man, a little boy, and a girl. And they basically told him that everything was going to be all right, and it was absolutely meant to happen like this. So essentially he's saying that he followed what they suggested he needed to do under the reassurance that by doing it, it would all be okay. Now, when it gets to trial, Scarver actually pleads insanity, which we can all understand to some degree. He's talking about voices in his head. He's talking about believing that he is the next second coming, shall we say. He's arguably stating that the reasoning behind his actions were, shall we say, produced because of the suggestions of the family within his head. But his defence fails, and he's found legally sane at the time of the killing. And because of that, he isn't sent to a hospital, he doesn't get treatment, instead he just gets life imprisonment. And also bear in mind the kind of crime that we're talking about today, he's going to be maximum security, and that's exactly what happens. He's incarcerated at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. So that prison itself is going to be full of people that you would not want to be with. And, you know, guys, I appreciate if you do the crime, you do the time. I know the platitudes. But even if you are a hardened killer, which he isn't, and he wasn't, there wasn't violence in his background, but even if you are, imagine sharing the next, I don't know, entire life with people like that. And you know, they're not going anywhere because they got the same sentences as you. 490 years, 1,200 years, 150 years, they'll always be your neighbours. That is not a nice situation for anyone. Just because you have made a mistake, or you are a nasty person, or you are a psychopathic killer, doesn't mean you want to be spending your time around psychopathic killers, for example. And that is a huge amount of stress. And the reason I'm throwing that in at this moment in time, this is not an excuse for people being sent to these prisons and places and being seen as victims. This is not what I'm saying. It's not an excuse for them in any way. I'm just saying that if you get it wrong, for example, and a person is mentally unwell, and you know, when you come here, you're never ever going to have me blame mental illness for murder. You know how it goes. Yes, some serial killers may also have a mental illness, but they were serial killers. The mental illness is not what makes them that. Arguably though, if you're in a prison and you have a mental illness, the stress that would be involved when you're around people that you feel might murder you at any moment, beat you up at any moment, rape you at any moment. These are realities in these kind of places. If you have a mental illness, wow, stress is going to exacerbate that. And that's going to be hugely problematic, isn't it? And I'm not saying this is the case for Scarver, but I'm saying if he wasn't actually sane, if he was dealing with schizophrenia and the terror that that can elicit within individual experiences and the suspicion and paranoia and all that goes with it, going into a high level, maximum security prison, that's going to potentially exacerbate symptoms at times. Now, on account of the fact that he has this mental state, he does actually go to a mental health wing within the prison. This is actually where he's diagnosed with schizophrenia and severe delusions, which again, for me, I asked the question, was it appropriate for him not to be given the insanity opportunity in court? Was it not his position evidenced by the fact that when he goes to prison, he has to go and have help because he's having severe delusions? Could it not be possible that he wasn't as sane as the prosecution managed to make out during his trial? Anyway, this is where we are. He gets prescribed antipsychotic medication and he's really unhappy. He really is. Look, he tries to kill himself on 2 occasions, and one of the occasions that he tries to kill himself, he actually sets himself on fire. That in itself is about destruction without care or consequence of the agony that that would create for the self. The desire to escape the being of the self, the desire to remove the self from the body is so enormous that even though to all intents and purposes, when you imagine how you would take your own life, you know, on the list of how setting myself on fire is probably not going to make your top 10. I appreciate we don't have a top 10 of those things, but you totally understand where I'm going with this. That is an incredibly terrifying, painful, and such destruction for the body if you survive, that it demonstrates a lack of conscious reality over what you're doing. And that's what he does. And that, to me, again, says we were probably dealing with a very stressed and very ill man at this moment in time. None of this is excusing any of his behaviour. He literally executed a man for no reason whatsoever. But on a mental health level, he's in a terrible place. And what can I say about the prison that he was housed in? I think, wow, would be the appropriate word. Because, I don't know, can't imagine things like sewing, drafts club, knitting club, art club, reading club, and any other pro-social clubs would exist in here. Nah, the kind of criminals that you got in that place are the type of truly terrifying humans that you would never wish to meet. And one of them, shall we say one very notable individual inhabiting the same space as Scarver, was the Milwaukee cannibal himself, the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer. So he actually arrived at that very institute around the same time as Scarver. Now, I know a lot of you will know Dahmer, but just to recap very, very quickly, Dahmer had had a 13-year killing spree. It shocked the world when he was arrested in 1991. He was given 16 life sentences for the murder of 17 teenage boys and young men. Wow, he had tortured them before killing them. He'd dismembered some of them, and in some cases, he'd even eaten his victims. He was also known as a necrophiliac. He had sex with their corpses post-mortem. Now, initially, when Dahmer arrived at the prison, you will understand why he'd been kept in social isolation. And the reason for that is not because they were afraid of him. They were afraid of the retribution, shall we suggest, of his fellow inmates. At the end of the day, people knew this guy had murdered 17 young boys and men, and they were black young boys and men. And that means that it also has a huge racial connotation And for those individuals who may see themselves as an individual who could have been a victim of Dahmer's, that could elicit rage. It could elicit a desire to protect those who are already dead by acting in a way that shows their allegiance with those lost people. Or it could be that they genuinely feel that they need to do something to him in case he harms them. So he's kept at a distance, and that means that he had very little interaction with the general prison population. But this changes. It's around a year into his sentence, and he's getting really restless in isolation. I think isolation is probably the worst psychological space that anyone can inhabit. I appreciate some of us, including myself, we all like a little me time. I like a few days on my own. I like that space where I can just sit and stare at walls and think, should I order a takeaway? Should I get a bottle of wine? Should I just sit here and stare at a wall? And I like that for a while. But the idea of being locked up by myself with literally nothing to do, I would go absolutely stir crazy. And I think most people can completely relate to that. It's also why a lot of people have problems with death row and solitary confinement, just because of the interaction-less experience and how that impacts on the mental state of those individuals who are having to endure it. So Dahmer doesn't want to remain in this place. During this period, he's managed to become a born-again Christian. It's amazing to me how many of them do that. I don't know. I can't wrap my little brain around it. I am a believer. I think that God is good and the big beautiful beyond is going to look after us for eternity. I'm not quite sure how it works and I don't care. It's just what I believe. But I still genuinely can't imagine that you go from being a serial killer to being a Christian. I genuinely think it's just an attentional and often manipulation-based thing. Come on. I totally murdered like loads of people horribly and I really enjoyed it and I carried on forever, but I got caught. But then I thought, well, now I've got nothing else to do for the rest of my life. I'm not going to be able to do that anymore. I thought I'd turn my attention to Christianity because it seemed like a good idea. Do you believe in any of it? No, not really. Just like the attention. You know, I don't get it. But it happens a lot with our serial killers. It really does. Apparently he studies the Bible. Probably like, I'm not doing very well here. There's a lot of stuff saying about damnation and going to hell and getting burnt in horrible scenarios. Maybe I need to think about finding a way where all this will be excused. Oh, I think there is a bit here. Wait a minute. If I repent and I mean it, it's all fine. So probably came across that, decided, need to get myself baptised. So he becomes a born-again Christian. And at this point, this baptism brings him into a new space and place where he obviously feels that he's willing to take the risk of joining the general prison population. The idea being, I imagine, that he's ready to repent and meet his maker if necessary. Because that, essentially, I think is what genuinely went on in his head. He's like, okay, maybe I will get murdered. Maybe I will get killed. Maybe things will go horribly wrong. But I'm going to accept that if that is how it's meant to play out, that's how it's meant to play out. So because of that, he's taken out of solitary confinement, joins the other prisoners. But this is why, again, I'm sorry. I know this is my particular belief system being projected onto you. I can't help it. If he has repented, if he's been baptised, washed of his sins, he's in the fold of the big God, Jesus is totally there for him, all of that stuff, right? That's what's going to happen when you repent. You don't repeat the cycle, although I know Catholics watching, you can, when you go at the weekend, and you do your Hail Marys, after confessing. But you know what I'm saying? That I think is just more because you want to make sure you've definitely repented enough. You're like, once a week, I'll definitely not have made too many mistakes by the point that I do that confession, and then it'll be fine again. But certainly, if you repent in this way, when you've had the gravity of crime that this man has had, Dahmer, definitely fits the bill for damnation and hell. You're going to be the best you possible, aren't you? You're going to be the best committed, born-again Christian that you can ever be. Don't know why. Did I do that dance then? Born-again Christians who are watching, I have no issue with that whatsoever. It's just that I was trying to suggest a more childlike action because he'd been reborn and it was a new opportunity. But I apologise if that was offensive in any way. So he gets taken out of solitary. But there's no repenting in the way that he acts because he does things that are really provocative. He does things to the other prisoners that will anger them without a doubt. I mean, they'd actually anger any of us. Those of you watching, you'd be really horrified if you were watching a man who'd serially killed these poor young men, almost goad people, almost see a level of pride within them, a way of taunting those around him. You know, that suggestion that he wanted to leave isolation because he'd repented and he was willing to meet his maker if necessary. To some degree, that's an unfortunate statement that he actually professed to make because he was indeed soon to meet his maker. It's as simple as that. Now, he's unpopular. They might be surprised by that, right? Why would this serial killer who ingested people's organs and had sex with their dead bodies, why would he be unpopular? So clearly, no one wants him around. He's somebody that is considered dangerous, depraved. He's done horrific things to these young men before murdering them. And he's not acting in any way like he has remorse. Because people feel within the authorities and certainly within the prison system that his life is actually at risk, he always gets escorted by at least one guard when he's out of his cell. All of those crimes that we've talked about in the previous video and that I've just kind of very quickly gone through today, they preceded him. They're synonymous with cannibalism. Also, remember his sexuality, he's gay, and he'd actually violated these young men, these young male victims, and that itself causes a particular stigma in prison. And then he also has this personality where he acts very superior. And part of that is because of the infamy, the nature of his crimes, the knowledge that people have about him, the reputation that he feels that he's accrued. That matters to him. And he kind of enjoys it from what I can see, and certainly from what I've read of other prisoners who've actually had contact with him during his incarceration. He even enjoyed, apparently, taunting the corrections officers and other prisoners with, how can I say it, sick flesh-eating humour. Would that cut it? So he would basically fashion severed body parts out of food and then he'd just cover it in ketchup so that it looked like blood. He was letting everyone know that this is him acknowledging what he did, and not just acknowledging it, but finding it funny. And then he'd just leave that food where the other prisoners would see them. There's a little bit in my head that instantly makes me think this guy definitely had a death wish. Yes, narcissistic, sociopathic, psychopathic, and without a doubt an individual who likes the superiority and arrogance and narcissism that goes with it, likes the standing of being feared. But also I think he hates prison. I don't think he believes he should be there. And he doesn't want to be there to some degree. And bear in mind that psychopaths, and certainly individuals who are psychopaths of his level, they don't feel pain in the same way that you or I do. We know that. We recognize that just like they don't feel empathy, which is a way of connecting with emotional pain often, they don't have that ability. Similarly, when it comes down to physical pain, they feel less. So risk-taking is going to be higher in these individuals. So one could argue, well, maybe it isn't that he just wants somebody to come and kill him. Maybe it's actually that he's an individual who just likes taunting people because he doesn't have fear and he doesn't really feel that pain impacts on him the way it would you or I. These are all possibilities. These are all potentials. I'm just throwing out my mixture of potential descriptions for the realities of his behaviour. But leaving that food in that way, it's gonna annoy people. People are gonna be pissed off with it. Also, he wrote a sign one day, put it on his cell wall, and it read, "Cannibals Anonymous, meeting tonight." So, on one level, that's dark humour. We all get it. It would never really be that funny unless you were doing a comedy show of some sort and you were kind of just bringing it in that way. A little bit dark humour, but obviously none of the comedians would have actually cannibalised anyone, therefore not actually a reality-based issue. But when you are the person who is a cannibal, known as a Milwaukee cannibal, at the end of the day, you're going to cause an issue when you put that on your wall. I wonder whether anyone turned up. It's like, hi, 7:30. I'm John. Could have. Don't think it did, but it could have. Maybe he was just hoping that Christian side of himself was going to be able to create a whole new support strategy. It didn't, obviously. We all know that. I'm just taking the mick. Anyway, it's annoying people. Also, he allegedly used to go to prison guards and sometimes prisoners, and he'd say, "I bite." I don't want to smile when I say that. It's just the sarcasm rushing through my veins, because genuinely, if he had come up to me as a prison guard and said, "Hey, I bite," I'd have been like, "I'm sorry, Jeffrey, I'm not going to even raise an eyebrow. It's reading, I don't know why I'm reading a book. I've decided that I'm reading a book as a prison guard. I should probably be watching things, but I'm not. I'm reading a book. I've started, so I'll finish. Sorry, Jeffrey, I'm really not going to start reading this book. Also, I'm reading it very fast. For those of you who can't see me doing this, I'm turning pages as if I'm just like a scan reader. Let's stop that. So, Jeffrey, I'm not going to look up from my book because everyone knows that you bite. Everybody knows you bite because you are the Milwaukee cannibal and we all know what you did and we're bored of you. Go away. Why don't you pop off and hold some kind of, I don't know, support group meeting for other individuals of such an ilk? No. Yeah, thanks, I might do that. Runs off to cell, writes note. Anyway, this is what's going on. He's putting himself to some degree in the line of fire as far as I'm concerned. And he starts getting involved in heated exchanges with other inmates as well. Now that's problematic because what we all know about Jeffrey Dahmer, he's not some kind of guy who would be able to survive the streets, is he? He's an individual who isn't, shall we say, street. He just isn't. And prison is full of people who are street. They're savvy, they're clever, and they're protective and defensive. So getting in rows with people, you don't use your intelligence in prison a lot of the time. You use your brute force, and there are consequences to your positions and actions. So we get to midnight in 94. Unsurprisingly, another prisoner, this person's called Osvaldo Dorothy, he actually attempts to slash Dahmer's throat with a makeshift shank. According to Dorothy, he'd heard what Dahmer had done, and he'd just become more and more fixated on him. He'd even managed, because of this fixation, and I don't know, I cannot celebrate, congratulate, or suggest for 1 minute that Dorothy is in any way a good person because of what I'm going to tell you. But I do kind of applaud the level of commitment and dedication that he has to this fixation on Dahmer, because he manages to engineer a transfer to the same prison. He actually manages to get there. A little bit of me wants him to have gone to the authorities there and been like, I need to move to where Dahmer is. Why? Because I've heard he's running a support group. Okay. I'm a cannibal too. And you want to go to his support group? Yeah. Is it all right if I get transferred there? Okay. No one else wants to go there, kid. It didn't happen like that at all. But the point is that he manages to get there. He says that he's got a mental illness. That's how he achieves it. And he actually ends up, would you believe it, next door to Dahmer. There is a little bit of me that feels a level of suspicion there. Is it just me? Is it just me, guys? I'm like, I don't think that Jeffrey Dahmer was a very popular person in prison. I don't think they liked him. And I'm just saying that Dorothy, this guy with a major fixation on wanting to kill Jeffrey Dahmer, doesn't just manage to get to the prison, he ends up next door to the serial killer. Does that seem like a little bit too coincidental? Just asking. Leave me a comment. Get involved with my chat. Let me know your thoughts. But basically, Dorothy wants to avenge the deaths of Dahmer's ethnic minority victims. He's really angry that these young men died in this way at the hands of a white man. So he's a Cuban immigrant himself, and he feels that it could have been him. He could have represented somebody that Dahmer would have chosen to murder. So he goes to that prison and he attacks him in the prison chapel. This is after there's the chapel service. Again, highly inappropriate place to attack anyone. I don't care how justified you are. A prison chapel or a church or a anywhere religious should never have people being attacked. It is a complete contradiction. And sorry, I think that if he was going to attack him, he should have waited a little bit later down the line, maybe done it at dinner when Dahmer was, I don't know, moulding some kind of mashed potato into something inappropriate. Not that I'm actually saying anybody should attack Dahmer, but you know what I mean. Prison chapels, sacrosanct, shouldn't happen. But he gets him in a headlock and he slashes his throat. But fortunately, the shank breaks. It wasn't sharp enough. So on this occasion, Dahmer is actually really lucky. He's able to escape with very minor injuries. Guards had ran in, they'd intervened relatively fast. And even though he's fine at this point, the next time he's not going to be so lucky. By the way, Dorothy, he actually received another 5 years on the sentence for the attack. You know what he said? He said he had no regrets. He didn't mind that he got an extra 5 years. He was proud of what he did. So going back to Scarver, when Dahmer does join the general population, Scarver just keeps clear of him. He's absolutely disgusted by his crimes. He can't believe that this white guy has murdered all of these black young men. But even though he finds him reprehensible, he doesn't really pay him a lot of attention, tends to watch him from a distance. He didn't have any interaction with him whatsoever. So it's not like he's had altercations, there haven't been run-ins, he's not got into physical disputes. He's just kind of observed him from a distance without any kind of connection with him. We get to the Monday that is absolutely infamous now, 28th of November 1994. This is when Scarver is going to have an interaction with Dahmer. And that interaction is going to be fatal, simple as that. So 25-year-old Scarver is put on cleaning duty, and he's put on cleaning duty with 34-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer and also 37-year-old Jesse Anderson. Now, Anderson, another interesting case, he was serving life at the time. He killed his wife. She was called Barbara and they killed her in April 1992. This was such a psychopathic killing. This is the kind of psychopath that somehow lives in the white collar area of the world. They don't stand out because they're really successful and nobody believes that they have this within them. More organized serial killer mindset to some degree, but obviously we're talking about him murdering his wife. And he had been in a relationship with her for a long time. He stabbed her 21 times. His wife, 21 times. He stabbed her in the face, the neck, the upper body. Came from nowhere. She fell into a coma and she died 2 days after that attack. And this is a guy, of course, who to everyone from the outside was living the dream. He was an affluent salesman. He and Barbara had 3 kids together. And no one could believe that this murder had taken place and that he was the guilty party. There was nothing that prepared people who knew them for that. Now, he initially claimed when the cops came that they had actually been attacked by 2 black men in a restaurant car park in Milwaukee. He even produced at the time, and this is how premeditated it was, an LA Clippers cap. He said that when there'd been the altercation with the killers, he'd managed to knock the cap off one of the attackers' heads. That clearly, again, means that he absolutely planned the murder without a shadow of a doubt. You know, he's actually got a cap with him. Imagine being Barbara and you're living with your murderer and you're not aware of what he's doing. And this man's planning your demise and even buying props to place in that moment. Anyway, the police are able to prove later down the line that he'd purchased both the cap and the murder weapon prior to the killing. He'd even done these superficial 4 stabs to his own chest because he thought that'd divert suspicion. I'm going to throw it out there, not that it's my job to advise anybody on how to get away with a murder. That is not the reasoning behind what I'm saying. But it's amazing to me that anybody thinks when the police arrive, it'll be fine. I have just brutally murdered this completely loved woman who no one has a bad word to say about because, I don't know, I want the life insurance. I don't want to get into trouble for doing this to my wife, who I've stabbed and brutalised 21 times. How can I get away with it? I'll just lightly stab myself 4 times because that will make sense. I can imagine when the police arrive, they'll totally understand. Yes, she was brutally stabbed 21 times. And you were stabbed 4 times. Well, I say stabbed, I mean you were scratched 4 times. Yes, scratched 4 times. Stabbed. They were stabbed. How did they get away with doing that to your wife and you only got the little stabs here? I was slippy. I was good at dodging. You did it, didn't you? The cap, I've got the cap. I've got a cap. The cap, it doesn't mean anything. You bought it, didn't you? Oh, I should have thought this through more. That genuinely is what blows my mind about these kind of killings. As if somebody's going to brutally murder one person and the other individual is going to walk away with superficial injuries. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't divert suspicion. It locks suspicion in. Anyway, these fake allegations, because of course, he's literally at this moment in time tried to blame 2 black men for this. So there are racial tensions because of it. And when it's discovered that he's just an absolute liar, that Anderson killed his wife purely for the $250,000 life insurance policy, can you imagine that? He murdered his wife, who was loyal to him, who was the mother of his 3 children, for $250,000. That was all he considered her life worth. And even worse, he tried to blame 2 men who were never even involved, essentially. And yes, they didn't find them because they were mythical. But the point is, it does happen sometimes that individuals are sentenced for crimes they didn't commit because people like that lie. You had a white man in a position of authority to some degree because of his middle class experience and his success. And he doesn't look like he'd be the type to kill his wife. He creates this story, which there is a bias in society, which it seems more reasonable to assume that they had been robbed and she'd been killed as a result of that. And he would have been willing, without a shadow of a doubt, if somebody had been caught wrongly for that, to have seen them go to prison whilst he ran off with the insurance money. So that is, again, a cold-blooded execution, if ever I've heard about one. And just keep that in mind, the racial tension issue, because as we talk about Scarver, I think that plays in a great deal to this. So on the morning that they're all on cleaning duty together, Dahmer's just 3 years into his multiple life sentence. He's got a 941-year sentence. I always love a good old OTT sentencing. Just love it. 941 years. Judge, no one lives that long. 941 years. Judge, literally, I mean, they think that maybe people are going to make it to 120 with good lifestyle choices and stuff in the future. 941 years. Can we not just say 200 to be reasonable? 3,648 years. And whoever this court person is who tried to advise me without realising I'm the bloody judge, get them. In fact, 633 years for the court warden giving bad advice. Anyway, 941 years, 3 years into it. Anderson's 2 years into his minimum 60-year sentence. And Scarver, he's 4 years into his sentence. Now, on that day, they're all assigned to clean the prison gymnasium. They arrive for duty 8 a.m. and at this point they're escorted by the guards, and of course to clean they need to be unshackled. But there's a big but here. Apparently they get left unattended. So obviously they start getting on with their duties, and after starting to mop the floor in the gymnasium toilet, Scarver claims that Dahmer or Anderson, so he doesn't actually disclose which one it definitely was, he said that one of them poked him in the back when he's filling a bucket of water. And when he looked to see which one of them had done it, he said that they looked like they were both allegedly laughing under their breath, which may well be something that he wished to create in that moment to excuse the behaviour that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And even if either of those individuals were indeed laughing at him or poking fun at him, what I'm going to describe next would still not be a reason for the actions that occur. So Scarver claims he just looked them both in the eyes because he tries to figure out which one of you did that, but he just couldn't identify which one of them had. But arguably he's making them both culpable, isn't he, by saying they're laughing about him under their breath. So now it's irrelevant which one did it, because they're both colluding with one another and making fun of him. Then the three men split up. Scarver follows Dahmer at this point to the staff locker room. Now, what Dahmer was completely unaware of regarding Scarver at that time is that he'd actually managed to conceal a 20-inch, 5-pound metal dumbbell bar from the weights room in his clothing. So he's now got a really serious weapon. And I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm throwing it out there. You don't need to agree with me. I feel potentially that, I don't know, there are 3 killers in this scenario, aren't they? All of them killers. One stabbed his wife to death brutally. Another one's murdered 17 young men. Another guy's just executed a bloke because he didn't get the right amount of money when he was robbing someone. They are cold-blooded murderers. Why have any of them had access at all to any weights? I mean, literally, they are weapons. And if they have access to things like a 5-pound metal dumbbell, surely, I don't know, there'd be a guard around to go, put that down, Scarver, put it down, know what you're thinking, seen the way you look at him. You know, at the end of the day, this is not an appropriate scenario to be able to play out per se. Now, according to Scarver, at this point, he manages to corner Dahmer near the locker room, and he apparently produces a newspaper clipping on the Dahmer murders, apparently carried it with him. So he confronts Dahmer with it. If I was Dahmer, I would immediately be like, why has this guy got a 5-pound dumbbell in his hands? Why has this guy not got any supervision? Where are the guards? And also, why have you picked a guy to come here when he's now unsupervised, carrying something to do with my crimes? Because, I don't know, feels a little bit coincidental, doesn't it? That this man has got this issue and now he's alone with Dahmer. Maybe it's just my incredibly suspicious nature. That's one of the things about doing crime content. You become more suspicious and more able to diligently decipher, as far as you're concerned, the reality of what's going on behind the whole scene that's playing out. It concerns me. I'm going to say it concerns me. So he carries this newspaper clipping of Dahmer everywhere, confronts Dahmer with it, and demands to know if he had done the things that were claimed in the actual paper. He said he was fiercely disgusted by it. That's the quote, fiercely disgusted. And Scarver said at this moment that Dahmer's really shocked, and also that he looks around for the door, but that Scarver actually blocks him. Yet, even though Dahmer is a psychopathic serial killer and somebody that we don't have any sympathy or empathy with, at the end of the day, in that moment, it's going to be shocking. You're just cleaning the floors all of a sudden there's a guy who has a weight with him that you know can literally break your brains in with. And on top of that, there's some kind of predisposition to wish to be there because he's got this article on Dahmer. So now Dahmer is dealing, and he was a clever guy, he's not just dealing with the reality of threat, he's dealing with the reality of it all coming to a point where things make sense. This guy wants to harm me. He's fixated because he's carrying this particular article on me, and he's genning himself up into a position where he feels legitimately entitled to cause damage to Dahmer. It must have been a very strange moment. At this point, obviously Dahmer can't get away, and Scarver just launches this brutal attack on him. He caved his head in. 2 blows from the metal bar, and he just repeatedly smashed his head into the wall. Apparently left him gurgling on the floor, and he was just covered in blood. One of the things that Scarver said was that it surprised him to some degree because Dahmer didn't try to fight back. He didn't try to raise the alarm. One could say there was a acceptance, a quiet acceptance of that fate. And Dahmer's family, they later went on to say he'd been ready to die for a long time. He'd accepted whatever happened to him in prison, whatever punishment befell him, he was ready for it. I'm not saying that it was something that he was inviting, but it wasn't something that he was fighting against. And I completely can see that perspective and point of view. I do want to throw this in as well, though, because it may well be that Dahmer just was like, yeah, I knew it was going to happen some point. I don't like prison. This isn't going to be that nice. Let's get it over with. Let's go. And, have that scenario without any kind of fight back. But could it be quiet acceptance, or could it be somebody smashed you in the head with a massive metal bar, literally rendering you unconscious? I don't know about you, but people who are unconscious and brutally beaten very rarely put up that much of a fight because they don't have a weapon to fight back with, and you smashed them in the head before they could do anything. I don't know whether, even though Dahmer's family know about those heinous crimes, they want to believe that Jeffrey Dahmer wished to die to make his passing easier. Because, like I said, he was looking for the door and he got smashed in the head. I'm not sure how quiet or loud you can be in those scenarios because it would happen so fast. It's unlikely he'd have had the moment to actually call for a guard. And he probably realised in thinking of that, the guard wouldn't get there quickly enough anyway. And then boom, it's gone, it's over. But this is what his mum would say in particular, that she'd always be asking him when he was in prison, are you safe? And he'd always reply, it doesn't matter. He didn't care what happened to him. And he believed that prison authorities knew that he was a marked man and that it was really just a matter of time before he got murdered. But even his own family said they were really shocked by the brutality of his death. And it interests me to think that Jeffrey Dahmer believed that the prison authorities felt he was a marked man. Because if they did, even though he is a horrific human predator who did the most terrifyingly disgusting things to people, he should still not be put in a position where it's possible that he gets murdered. If they feel that way, that would be something that I would consider deeply unjust on the basis that he's been tried through the very system that exists to try these individuals. He's been punished in the way that the justice system believes is correct, and therefore he's serving his sentence. It shouldn't be a scenario where literally every day he thinks, is it going to be the end of my life this day? I don't think anyone should live in that situation. Yes, apparently it was the big God. It wasn't Scarver. He was merely a puppet on a string for the big God up there in heaven. I don't think that's all right. I don't think God would think it's all right either. Imagine it'll go something like this. God, you are not going to believe this. What is it, Archangel Gabriel? It's Dahmer. As in the wacky cannibal Dahmer. Yeah, he's dead. Oh, okay. Right, round up all of his victims. They're having an amazing time, but they want to see this. Then, remember what we decided we're going to do. The lift's going to come up, he's going to come out, it's going to be like, no way. I'm in heaven. That whole born-again Christian baptised thing's worked. I'm going to spend eternity in bliss. And then, yeah, remember, the devil, we've organised, he's going to just appear just from the other lift, and then just all of it's going to shove him in the lift, take him down, getting hotter and hotter and hotter, all the way to hell for eternity. Oh, I've been excited about this for quite a long time, actually, around 4 years. Yeah, I know, but that's not why I'm here. How can it get better than that? It can't, God. The man who's killed him said that you did it. He said that I did it. He said that you did it. Well, he is a very naughty, naughty boy. Don't imagine that happened. In my head it does. I like the idea of all of the victims of Dahmer just waiting outside the lift and then just shuffling him into eternity of damnation. Fortunately, he can go up at the same time as Anderson, and his wife can be waiting to do the same. Probably with a little stabby thing. You know, little stabby thing. Here are some real injuries. Anyway, I digress. So they find Dahmer, and he's found at 8:12 a.m. He's in a real state. He's in the staff bathroom. He's literally lying in a pool of blood. He is breathing, but he's really unresponsive, and apparently he'd been so beaten that he was unrecognisable. His facial features had just swollen, and it was grotesque for those who found him. Anderson then gets found shortly after. He's in a similar state in a locker room. Both of them at this point are rushed to the Divine Saviour Hospital. It's in Portage, but I mean, there's nothing that they could do. They'd both been mortally wounded, and Dahmer was pronounced dead just an hour later. And then Anderson did actually get put on life support, but it was switched off 2 days later. It was irredeemable. There was no way that the injuries they had were conducive with life. Now, what I would say is after this, there are some different stories. There's a lot of controversy. First of all, how the hell does Scarver get to carry out the killings completely unchallenged? Bearing in mind that we know that Dahmer's always going to have people around him because they're expecting these kind of issues. Columbia County Sheriff James D. Smith would later be quoted as saying there were actually 8 people around at the time. So there were 2 guards, there was a recreation director, and then there were the other inmates. What? Really? Why would you say that? Because that would mean that if there were these people present, Scarver was able to beat 2 men to death in 2 different locations without detection. I am pretty sure he isn't an Avenger. I don't think he's a baddie from the Marvel films. At the end of the day, it is not going to be possible to beat 2 people to death quietly when there are lots of people around. Also, it's worth noting that there are other ideas around how this played out. So a lot claim it was an inside job. They think that the guards were aware that Dahmer was hated and that Scarver really hated Dahmer, and they actually orchestrated it. They put them on cleaning duty together, and then they made themselves scarce. Apparently, in that belief system, the philosophy behind that particular idea is that they wanted Dahmer dead. And a former inmate went on to claim that Dahmer was even dead before the ambulance had arrived, and that the guards were actually in the bathroom whilst Dahmer and Anderson were murdered. Because let's be honest, if that sheriff is saying there were all these people around, well, that would likely mean that people did see it happen. So it has to be either, without doubt, inappropriate unprofessionality that led to the deaths because they weren't present, they were doing something else when they shouldn't have been, or it's collusion. The scenario was created so the perfect storm could unfold and they just stood by and let it happen. It's also claimed that Anderson was given $100 for the killings. There's also other theories that say that the reason that he killed Dahmer was that Dahmer had attacked black victims. And of course, Anderson had tried to frame 2 black men for the murder of his wife. Also, it's said that Anderson was allegedly someone who defaced a portrait of the civil rights leader Martin Luther King, which a prisoner had painted. Apparently, they painted a red dot on the forehead, and that was meant to represent a bullet hole. So Scarver really believed that Anderson was a racist. And so this racially motivated possibility is also something that plays into the possibilities. Now, in subsequent interviews, what I will tell you is that Scarver's implied that he was absolutely enraged by the lack of remorse that Dahmer seemed to show. And he was quoted as saying, "Some people who were in prison are repentant, but he was not one of them." When they did the full investigation as into how these killings played out, they actually concluded that Scarver acted alone, and they also concluded that there was no evidence of a racial motive. Interesting bit of trivia for you. Despite the fact that Dahmer had literally had his head beat into a pulp and he was confirmed dead, they apparently kept him shackled until the autopsy. Yeah. When they did the autopsy at the University of Wisconsin Hospital in Madison, at this point, they removed them. I don't know why. In my head, it goes something like, okay, we've got to transport him for his autopsy. Just take the shackles off. No. Why? Because, John, you're being ridiculous. He's dead. We know he's dead. There's no signs of life. He doesn't need his shackles. We're taking him to a hospital for an autopsy. We're not taking any risks. What are you on about? If, and only if, zombies exist, he's likely to be one. Have you been watching too much of The Walking Dead or World War Z? Just don't take any chances. And if he gets up, go for the head. Anyway, they did that. They kept him shackled. Unbelievably, they needed to do the autopsy. I don't know why, because it was very obvious he died of very severe head injuries. There were multiple fractures to his head. He had lots of brain trauma. And they said that when they did the autopsy, they figured out he'd probably been alive for 1 minute to 2 minutes after the brutal assault. So he wasn't there malingering in his death. Now, despite all of that brain trauma that was clearly there, I mean, you can imagine being hit the way that he was, they actually removed Dahmer's brain. They took it because they wanted to preserve it for future study. And I think that's quite poetic justice when you think about what Dahmer did to his victims and to their body parts. And to some degree, I actually probably think that Dahmer would want them to do that as well. I imagine that he had such a macabre interest in physiology and the body, and also his desire to create a human zombie and so on and so forth, that he already knew there was something broken within him. And it's not that he would want to redeem himself. I think he'd have a genuine interest to know whether there was anything that they could find out. Simple as that. I suppose what we can say with Dahmer's demise in this is it teaches us an important lesson. Live by the sword, die by the 20-inch metal bar, as they say. They don't say that, do they? I just made that up entirely. You know where I'm going with it. So Scarver, after these killings, he initially pleads insanity, but then he does change that plea to a no contest. And the reason that he does that is in making that plea, he gets to be exchanged from the prison that he's in to a federal penitentiary. So he gets a transfer. Now, he does receive another 2 life sentences for the killings, and he should have, without a doubt. Now, apparently when he's moved there, he spent over a decade in solitary confinement after the murders. Now, the reason for that is obviously he's considered high risk and he's considered a major risk to other inmates. But that situation absolutely amplified his schizophrenia, his psychotic breaks, which is just horrific, isn't it? Because if you're already dealing with that very challenging mental illness and you're dealing with some quite scary experiences just as a human being, and then you have so little interaction or distraction because you're on your own, that's going to be massively stressful, and stress is going to be a huge exacerbator of these issues. Scarver even went on down the line to bring a civil action against Wisconsin's secure program facility, and the reason for that is he claimed that his constitutional rights had been breached. He said that the alleged time that he had spent in solitary confinement equated to cruel and unusual punishment. I don't know about you. I personally think that maybe having to clean toilets with Jeffrey Dahmer was actually cruel and unusual as well, throwing it in there. And when he was in that solitary confinement, his cell was windowless, and he sometimes had to endure 100-degree heat. 100-degree heat. Now, that's a huge risk of heat stroke, and heat stroke is even exacerbated when you're on antipsychotic medication, so it's even more dangerous. Bear in mind, he had absolutely no distractions. The lights were left permanently on. So inhumane. And the voices in his head, they started to really gather weight regarding harm, so he would self-harm regularly. He attempted to overdose on 2 occasions. And in spite of all that, the court actually dismissed his lawsuit. And the reason they did that is they said, look, all of those restrictions you caused for yourself, they were justified. You risk an issue for the general population. You've shown that you are dangerous to the other prisoners. This is what you've caused on yourself. So that accountability and responsibility that he wishes to deny, they uphold. Now, Scarver was moved to lots of different prisons after killing Dahmer, and this is mainly because of his mental state. And he's ultimately transferred to the Centennial Correctional Facility that's in Cannon City, Colorado. And that's where he remains today. And one of the things that he says is that he feels that his psychosis, his schizophrenia, psychotic breaks in particular, he feels they're a lot to do with his diet. He feels that certain foods trigger them, like bread, refined sugar, etc. So he's trying obviously to figure out ways of minimizing those issues for himself. Also, he stayed in contact with his son Christopher. So as you know, he was born just after his incarceration. And throughout his life in prison, he's had this relationship, and he's encouraged him to study. He's encouraged Christopher to do sport. And let me tell you, Christopher has excelled academically. He's won scholarships. These have been paid in part by the Creative Corrections Education Foundation, and that's something that's set up to help students whose parents are in prison. And he ultimately graduated with a degree in sociology. And I think that says something really beautiful about Christopher. The fact that he's an individual with such compassion, who's not just athletically gifted, academically gifted, he's also clearly very forgiving and understanding and empathic. And even though his father is in prison for really heinous, inexcusable actions, he sees past that and has accepted the encouragement that his father has given him. And it really leaves a good feeling knowing that that's happened for me. That whilst Scarver didn't become this pro-social individual who lived a life that he probably was capable of, but that just never happened, his son has been able to do that for him to some degree. Scarver today, it's really interesting when you think about the kind of person that I've been describing through this. He is somebody who spends his days painting, writing songs, doing music compositions. He writes short stories, he writes poetry. He even writes prison policy proposals. I'd be like, I want to do the prison policy proposals. Emma, you can't do them. Why? Because every single time you do the prison policy proposal, point 1 is Emma gets released to a castle with an income of £5 million a year from the state. I think it's a brilliant proposal. Emma, just go back and peel the potatoes. Anyway, he does all of these things, even self-published poetry books, and he hopes one day to complete a college course in mechanical and electrical engineering. You've got to bear in mind, this guy was 23 when he began his initial life sentence, and he's actually been incarcerated 30 years. That means he's spent more of his life in prison than free. Some people act as if Scarver was a hero or is a hero because of the fact that he killed Jeffrey Dahmer. But if you believe that, then you completely deny the reality of what actually happened. Steve Lohman was a 27-year-old man. He was just going about his workday when an individual who wanted money for drugs and alcohol came in, lay him on the ground and shot him in the head. That's what Scarver did. So he was never in a position to take moral high ground when it came to Dahmer's crimes. Yeah, Dahmer had set the bar about as low as it got in that regard. But Scarver didn't set it much higher. Scarver really did not set it much higher. He was a cold-blooded killer. In fact, all of those I've talked about today in regards to this crime, that's the commonality, isn't it? Each one of them had no regard for human life. But at least one of them now gets to spend their day painting, writing poetry, and suggesting prison policy. I hope you found this case interesting. I hope it's filled in some of the gaps if you know a lot about Dahmer. And I hope that we can all agree that when all comes to all, the victims in this are people like Scarver's son, who grew up without a dad to some degree, at least in the free sense, and certainly the man that Scarver murdered and all the victims of Dahmer and Barbara Anderson's wife, because those lives were ended, and it's just a horrible, horrible shame. Join me next time, please do. Let me know your thoughts. Did you know about this case, or has it been intriguing? Do you think that he was moral and righteous in murdering Dahmer and Anderson? Or like me, do you think that's a very warped perspective and perception about just killing? Take care, guys. Be safe.